81 days and nights, not just a number, but also a symbol of blood, tears and resilience. Quang Tri Citadel in 1972. A small piece of land that became the center of one of the most brutal battles of the 20th century.
It's here, the largest battle in the Vietnam War. This will be a battle of attrition between the North Vietnamese army and the Americans. It's going to be a battle like no other. And this is going to be the story of the Battle of Quang Tri. The year before, in 1971, a North Vietnamese offensive known as the Easter Offensive, or Nguyen Hue Offensive, was launched, which saw them capture several key cities in South Vietnam, including the city of Quang Tri. Quang Tri was an important city because it was right on the 17th parallel, the dividing line between North and South. But more importantly, it was home to the Quang Tri Citadel, 2 square kilometers of ancient walls that were just begging to be taken by either side. On May 1972, after consolidating their gains from the previous year, US and South Vietnamese forces launched Operation Lam Son 72 with the objective of retaking the city. On paper, the South Vietnamese Army, also known as the ARVN, and the US had the advantage. They had 30,000 troops at their disposal compared to the 10,000 to 12,000 of the North Vietnamese Army. They also had massive air and naval support. In total, they dropped 328,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnamese positions during the siege. That's 7 times the amount of bombs dropped on Hiroshima. The NVA, on the other hand, had very few tanks, mostly T-54s and PT-76. They had scarce artillery and supplies. The vast majority of their firepower came from recoilless rifles, RPGs, and anti-tank weapons. The terrain didn't help matters either. The area surrounding the citadel was a muddy mess thanks to the monsoon season. This made it extremely hard for vehicles to move around, forcing most of the fighting to be done on foot. With all of this in mind, let's jump into it. Part 1, the Citadel Under Fire, June to July 1972. Day 1 to 3, the opening inferno. The battle began with US B-52s launching carpet bombing raids on the Citadel at dawn on June 28th. These raids continued throughout the day, and each raid involved thousands of pounds of explosives being dropped on the city. This went on for 3 days, flattening the outer defenses of the city and allowing the ARVN to launch their assaults without much resistance. The ARVN's plan was to launch a multi-pronged assault on the city, attempting to breach the eastern and southern gates. On the first day alone, they attacked 16 times but were repelled each time. The NVA had prepared well for this attack with well-built bunkers and anti-tank mines, which the ARVN forces failed to notice. As darkness fell on June, the NVA counterattacked, pushing the ARVN back across the river. Day 4-7, stalemate in the rubble. By the second day of the battle, street-to-street combat had broken out inside the eastern quarters. Most of the buildings had been destroyed by the airstrikes, leaving the 2 armies to fight amongst the rubble. Attempts by ARVN armored units to push through the city were stalled when the roads collapsed under their weight. Meanwhile, the NVA used the cover of darkness and the ruined temples to set up trench networks and sniper nests. By the end of July, both sides had suffered hundreds of casualties. Day 8 to 10, counteroffensive raids. During the night of July, elements of the 2nd NVA Regiment conducted sapper raids against the approaching ARVN troops. Their objective was to blow up the ARVN artillery positioned on the high ground west of the citadel. To do this, they snuck into the city undetected and planted explosives at several locations. Then in the early hours of the morning, they detonated their explosives, destroying 3 105mm howitzers and 1 155mm long tom gun. With their artillery knocked out of the fight, the ARVN were forced to use mortars instead. The NVA, meanwhile, were forced to abandon their flooded trenches and take up positions in the higher rubble mounds, giving the enemy a clear line of sight. This turned out to be a fatal mistake, because every time the NVA raised their heads above the rubble to fire their weapons, they were picked off by American snipers. This led to what was called kill zones, where the NVA would charge across open ground, firing blindly into the tall grass, hoping to hit an enemy soldier. But more often than not, they were met with incoming bullets and rockets. Day 11-15, artillery hell. By July, the US and ARVN had a total of 48 artillery batteries surrounding the citadel. Every day they fired over 10,000 shells into the city. Meanwhile, the NVA had only a handful of captured howitzers and mortars to return the favor. The result was predictable. Thousands of civilians fled south under the constant pounding. But even still, the NVA held strong and managed to repel wave after wave of attacks. One interesting thing about the NVA was their ability to rotate fresh battalions into the fight. They did this via a series of underground tunnels that ran beneath the city. Even though the army was suffering heavy casualties, their morale remained high because they always knew that they would soon be relieved by fresh troops. Day 16-18, first major push, repelled. On July, the ARVN attempted their first major push to reclaim the western wall of the citadel. At 10 a.m., a coordinated air and land assault began. A battery of 105mm howitzers bombarded the NVA positions, followed by 250 airstrike sorties. Then thousands of ARVN troops charged across the river, engaging the NVA in hand-to-hand combat. The battle raged for hours with heavy losses on both sides. But when the dust settled, the wall was still in NVA hands. Despite the ferocity of the battle, it was nothing compared to what was coming next. In Part 2, we'll see how the US doubles down on its air campaign, turning the city into a fiery inferno. We'll see the arrival of the Green Berets and the desperate attempts to take the city. We'll also see some incredible stories of survival from both sides. If you want to see that, then make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Story of the Siege of Quang Tri. This is Part 2 of a 2-part series. If you want to watch Part 1, click the card in the top right corner or check out the description below. Day 19-25. War of the Trenches. By mid-July, the initial onslaught had subsided. The maelstrom of steel and fire had momentarily dulled, leaving behind a landscape of devastation and despair. Yet amidst the smoldering ruins, a new phase of the battle was born. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA troops, with grim determination, began to dig secondary lines of defense. Behind the collapsed ramparts of Quang Tri's crumbling wall, they carved out a labyrinth of trenches and fortified bunkers. This transformed the battlefield into a war of attrition, a protracted duel where survival and endurance were the ultimate victors. The monsoon, as if in sync with the changing tides of the battle, unleashed its fury. Torrential rains turned the trenches into cesspools of mud and waste. Rivers swelled, bursting their banks and climbing over the parched lands. Water, once a life source, now threatened to engulf everything in its path. Many sought refuge in the upper levels of buildings, only to find themselves surrounded by stagnant pools. With each passing day, water became more precious than gold. Both sides rationed what little they could collect, turning every drop into a measure of survival. NVA soldiers, hardened by years of conflict, subsisted on 2 rice balls a day, their meals soaked in rainwater. Civilian women and children, their faces streaked with dirt, hauled water from distant springs, each step a gamble against the deluge that seemed determined to swallow the city whole. In this watery labyrinth, a different kind of battle raged, one against unseen enemies like disease. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery stalked the land, thriving in the contaminated water and lack of basic sanitation. Children with distended bellies bore witness to the silent suffering. Mothers clutched their infants close, praying for a respite from the onslaught of illness that spared none. All the while, amidst these hardships, the NVA soldiers held their ground. They stood firm in their trenches, their bodies weary, their spirits unbroken. Their mantra, "Every clay brick of Quang Tri was paid for in human blood," resonated through the ranks. And so they endured, resisting not only the physical hardships, but also the gnawing hunger and the persistent dread of the next airstrike. Day 26 to 32. Firestorms of August. Begin on July as the skies cleared after weeks of monsoon rains. The ARVN launched its long-awaited counterattack. It was a thunderous assault. The first salvos of artillery barrages shook the foundations of the city, followed by waves of South Vietnamese infantry. The scene was straight out of a nightmare, reminiscent of the firestorms of Dresden or Tokyo during World War II. Through billowing clouds of smoke, flames danced against the backdrop of a darkening sky. Homes and buildings were engulfed, turning the familiar streets into a macabre maze. Amidst this inferno, the NVA, aware of the impending storm, withdrew to secondary trenches in the morning, thus avoiding the brunt of the shelling. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, they launched their own attacks. They fought to reclaim lost ground, exploiting the darkness and confusion to infiltrate enemy lines. In this back and forth, thousands fell on both sides. In the first week of August alone, the casualty count exceeded 2,000 men, a grim prelude to the coming hell on Earth. Faced with the ferocity of the NVA, the ARVN found itself in a battle not just of armies, but of wills. The NVA, though dwindling in numbers, refused to yield. They fought with a desperation born of starvation and fatigue, yet also with the steely resolve of those with nothing left to lose. Their tactics, born out of necessity, were proving effective. They used hit-and-run maneuvers, disappearing into the labyrinthine trenches after launching surprise attacks. Despite the carnage, the NVA held. Each man was a testament to his nation's unbending spirit, every fiber of his being dedicated to the struggle. Day 33 to 45. Mid-siege deadlock. As August progressed, exhaustion began to creep into the front lines. The relentless assaults eased, giving way to smaller skirmishes. Still, the terrible casualties continued, but no side could muster enough strength for a decisive push. The seething cauldron of Quang Tri had reached a stalemate. The lull in the fighting, however, was deceptive. It provided a facade of calm that belied the seething tensions below. The ARVN, regrouping and reevaluating, tried a different tactic. They blasted propaganda through loudspeakers stationed on tank turrets. The messages were simple, tempting offers for the NVA soldiers, promises of safety, food, and even freedom if they surrendered. Leaflets rained down from the sky, each one a potential lifeline to a soldier weighed down by the siege's burden. But these overtures went largely unheard. Deep within the besieged zone, NVA officers huddled together, poring over maps and discussing the dire situation. Thoughts of retreat or surrender flickered in their minds. They considered the possibility of a nighttime escape through the minefields or a desperate dash across the open terrain. Yet Ho Chi Minh's words echoed in their ears, urging them to hold. His message, though received weeks ago, was as relevant then as it was the moment it was sent. He implored them to resist, to transform every house and street into a fortress, to turn every citizen into a soldier and every soldier into an exemplary fighter. They were not to surrender under any circumstances. Meanwhile, the civilian population eked out an existence, scavenging for food and water, tending to the sick and dying. Life in the besieged city had been reduced to a primal struggle for existence, yet hope flickered in the face of despair. Some NVA soldiers, risking their lives, ventured out into the ravaged city to collect rainwater, their canteens precious vessels of survival. Others, drawing strength from shared hardship, forged bonds of camaraderie that transcended the bonds of blood. As the siege dragged on, the NVA recognized the futility of the situation. Holding on to a liberated Quang Tri was pointless. Any attempts at escape were fraught with danger and almost certainly would result in death. So they held on not because they expected victory, but because they were too tired to do anything else. They had entered the city expecting to fight and die. Now they were stuck living and dying in the most brutal conditions imaginable. Day 46 to 55. The white phosphorus weeks on August. A new horror descended upon the beleaguered city. White phosphorus bombs. The skies filled with incendiary devices unleashing a fiery rain on the already devastated landscape. When they exploded, they turned the battlefield into a literal sea of fire. The air grew thick with the stench of burning flesh. Screams echoed over the city as men were engulfed in flames, seeking solace in the suffocating embrace of tunnels. For the NVA, the sprawling network of subterranean passages became a lifeline. Though claustrophobic and poorly ventilated, these rat holes offered some respite from the raging inferno above. Here, amidst the dim oil lamp lights, troopers shielded themselves from the burn injuries, inhaling smoke and enduring the stifling heat. Outside, bombs continued to detonate, sending shockwaves that rattled their makeshift shelters. The earth trembled, threatening to collapse their underground sanctuaries. But still they endured, drawing strength from each other's presence, sharing stories of home and loved ones, in an attempt to keep their spirits aloft. Day 56-65. Final encirclement forms. By late August, the ARVN forces had pushed closer, closing in on the city from all sides. They managed to capture ground north of the Thach Hun River, severing vital supply lines leading into the city. The NVA found itself squeezed into a shrinking pocket, their options for escape effectively cut off. Within this tightening circle, conditions became increasingly desperate. Ammunition dwindled to a few precious clips per soldier, symbolic rather than substantial. Weapons, once symbols of power, now lay silent, their barrels empty. Food had become a distant memory, replaced by an aching emptiness in their stomachs. Men ate what little they could find, foraging for roots and berries, eating grass and leaves. Many resorted to drinking salty ocean water, hoping to stave off dehydration. Yet amidst this desperate struggle, the NVA soldiers held their ground. With feverish determination, they fought not just for a cause, but for each other, for the memory of those who had fallen, and for the hope of a better tomorrow. Each man was a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity, a symbol of resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. Their sacrifice, though largely forgotten, was a quiet ode to courage and resilience. They were the true heroes of Quang Tri, the men who stood against a tide of fire and fury, and in doing so, etched their names in the annals of history. The final 16 days of the 81-day siege of Quang Tri saw the North Vietnamese army clinging onto the ruins of the ancient citadel. In this third and final part of our series, we examine the last battle for control of this symbolic location and how the Vietnamese people honored those who fought here. Welcome back to the channel. This is the story of the 81-day siege of Quang Tri. We continue today with part 3, the final 16 days, covering days 66 to 75. And then we'll wrap up this series with the fall of the city and its aftermath.
Before we begin, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. We also have a membership program, which offers some exclusive benefits, such as early access to videos. Consider signing up. Conditions on the ground. By mid-September, the monsoon season was at its peak. During the day, temperatures soared around 40 degrees Celsius. The city of Quang Tri itself lay in ruins. There was no source of clean water, no aid, and no hope of relief. Any chance of outside assistance had vanished long ago. Logistical collapse had set in.
No reinforcements could reach the besieged defenders, and what was left of the North Vietnamese army inside the city clung to life amidst the crumbling remains of the citadel. Over the previous 65 days, they had fought tenaciously in dug-in positions, and in the labyrinth of ruined bunkers and horrifying close quarters, combat that echoed the grim trench warfare of World War I. Now they battled against all odds, enduring extreme thirst and the relentless sun as the battlefield fell into a state of utter devastation. Defensive preparations. For the North Vietnamese Army, defensive preparations had relied heavily on a network of hastily improvised tunnels and foxholes that crisscrossed the debris-filled landscape. These subterranean passages allowed soldiers to move around somewhat safely from one fighting position to another, though conditions underground were dark, dank, and insufferable. They provided a degree of protection from the punishing aerial bombardments that continued even as the NVA's regular fighting strength dwindled. Each man, woman, and child inside the city had been pressed into service. All able-bodied civilians assisted in the defense. Women served as snipers, children carried messages, and everyone helped dig and reinforce the myriad of bunkers, trenches, and tunnels. Amidst the ruins, every available inch of the city was transformed into a potential killing ground. Improvised booby traps were laid everywhere. Camouflaged anti-personnel mines lay hidden beneath the rubble. And at every turn, North Vietnamese soldiers were ready to unleash their final volleys upon the advancing enemy. Horrific combat. Throughout this phase of the siege, the remaining NVA units fought fiercely. Aware that their situation was hopeless, they were determined to inflict maximum casualties on their attackers. Hand-to-hand fighting was common, and entire squads often wiped out in close combat. Supplies ran out long before men did. Hunger and thirst took a heavy toll, but exhaustion played an even greater role. Sleep deprivation combined with a lack of nutrition sapped the defenders' strength. Still, as each wave of attackers was repelled and the sun beat down mercilessly on the ruined city, the defenders held on desperately to their guns and their will to survive. Casualties. Unfortunately, casualty figures for the last few days of the siege are rather scarce. However, over the entire siege, sources estimate that the NVA suffered around 10,000 casualties, of which around 4,000 were killed. On the other side, ARVN losses amounted to roughly 7,556 killed. Of this, the Marine Division suffered 977 dead, and the Airborne heavily hit. Approximately 20 US servicemen were also killed during this phase. Days 76 and 80. The decision to withdraw. As the relentless bombing raids continued and the once proud citadel lay in smoldering ruins, it became clear that the city was untenable. After 75 days of heroic resistance, senior leadership in Hanoi ordered a tactical withdrawal. This difficult decision was made on September 11, 1972. The order was issued by the Political Committee of the Communist Party in Hanoi. Their objective? To preserve as much of the remaining North Vietnamese army as possible for future engagements. This event marked the end of the defensive position and the beginning of the dangerous journey across the Tha Chan River. Night movements. Commencing on the night of September 11th and continuing over the next 4 nights, elements of the NVA began to evacuate. Under the cover of darkness and the monsoon rains, they slipped across the river. Evacuation efforts continued intermittently until the 15th. Wounded soldiers were brought out first, followed by those able to move. Civilians were evacuated when possible. Soldiers destroyed whatever materials they could not take with them, slowing ARVN's advance and forcing them to expend valuable resources. On the enemy, bridges were blown up, factories and warehouses were demolished, and anything that could be of use to the South Vietnamese was rendered useless. Tactical acumen. Even in retreat, the North Vietnamese army exhibited tactical acumen. Units harassed the pursuing ARVN forces, setting ambushes and utilizing the thick undergrowth along the riverbanks to their advantage. Mines were left scattered across the path, claiming more victims as the South Vietnamese pursued their fleeing foes. Despite the difficulties and the risk of exposure, the NVA successfully preserved a significant portion of its manpower, a testament to its training and tenacity. Day 81, the fall of Quang Tri. On the morning of September 16, 1972, South Vietnamese Marines and assorted ARVN units launched their final assault. By dawn, they had broken through the NVA's defensive lines. By approximately 12:45 p.m., a Marine company raised their flag over the west gate of the ancient citadel, signaling the recapture of Quang Tri. The battle for the citadel was over. A city in ruins. When the South Vietnamese entered the city, what they saw was nothing short of devastation. More rubble than buildings remained. Homes were destroyed, corpses littered the streets, and the stench of death hung heavy in the air. The citadel itself was a scene of utter devastation. Its ramparts breached, its gates shattered, and its once proud spirit broken. The cost of victory had been immense. The siege and devastation revealed. Over the 81 days, Quang Tri had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Both military and civilian casualties had been catastrophic. When the siege came to an end, the NVA's presence in the city was effectively wiped out. One estimate places NVA losses in the vicinity of 4,000 killed. ARVN suffered an estimated 8,135 casualties and killed. However, the true extent of the devastation will probably never be fully known. Among the missing and dead were countless civilians whose lives were lost in the crossfire or ended due to the siege's harsh conditions. Strategic outcome. Although the NVA was pushed out of the city, their 81-day defense of Quang Tri became a potent symbol of Vietnamese resilience and determination. During the later Paris peace talks of 1973, North Vietnam used the siege as leverage, emphasizing their ability to endure and resist despite overwhelming odds. Human cost. The siege of Quang Tri stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of war. Soldiers fought without food or water, enduring unimaginable hardship and making impossible choices to survive. The civilian population bore the brunt of the indiscriminate artillery barrages and aerial bombings. Homes were destroyed, livelihoods shattered, and futures cut short. Symbolism. Today, the Quang Tri ancient citadel, now referred to as the cemetery without graves, serves as a hallowed site of remembrance and a powerful symbol of Vietnamese patriotism and sacrifice. Restored and preserved, it has become one of the country's most important national relics. The citadels, ramparts, and walls are now silent, but they echo with the memory of those who fought and died here. The 81 days of fierce struggle during the siege of Quang Tri remain a defining chapter in Vietnamese history, a solemn tribute to courage, endurance, and the unbreakable spirit of a nation. We've come to the end of this series. If you enjoyed the video, please show your support. Your support means a lot and helps us keep producing quality content. Thanks again for watching.